We have one more story to get to before we
Yes,
leave,
we
and
do.
that is Colombia. The Colombia climb down, I'm calling it. Oh, look at that. Very happy to be joined to discuss the row between the U.S. and Colombia, President Petro, and some of everything around that by Zoe Alexandra, the journalist and editor of People's Dispatch, back with us here. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you as always. A bit of whiplash in Colombia several days ago. There's a whole context to it, but of course there was a video that came out of Brazilian migrants being returned by the United States. The conditions were obviously, not conditions that humans should really be transported in. They're obviously being treated poorly. So the Colombian president comes out, says, we're not going to accept our migrants until they're in a more sort of regularized flight. There's, this huge issue, and Trump threatens them. Petro says we're going to fight back, and then several hours later he totally backs down. I mean, I don't know. Give us some context as to what happened here.
Yeah, I mean that's a good surface recap, and I think it was a very intense day. This happened on Sunday. The flight of the Brazilian deportees happened on Friday night, and just to give a little bit more context on that, there were Brazilian migrants who were being deported on U.S. military planes, and they made a technical stopover in Manaus, which is in the north of the country, earlier than they were supposed to. And when Brazilian authorities saw them coming off the plane, with in the conditions that they were in, which was handcuffed and had their feet also, linked together, they actually they didn't, there were videos circulating, but the Brazilian authorities also essentially took custody of them and said, we'll take it from here. We're going to fly them the rest of the way to Belo Horizonte, which is the city in the southern central part of Brazil. And the Brazilian government um, had sent a note to Secretary of State, sent a note to the White House, basically protesting this treatment. Um, and again, kind of we see that these a lot of these deportation flights are part of agreements that are made through the U.S. government with these countries, because of course, in order to fly into another country's airspace, you have to have an agreement with the country. So they said, we want to kind of revisit the terms of this agreement given this treatment. And Petro says on late on Saturday night, early Sunday, essentially having he doesn't specifically reference Brazil, but I think from the context we can tell, having seen this, we won't accept it. Um, as you said, Trump not immediately retaliates. He actually waited till the afternoon of Sunday, retaliates with a threat to impose 25% tariffs on Colombia, which would increase to 50%, and suspend visas for all members of the Petro government, as well as kind of vaguely referencing supporters and parties. Arguably, we might be referring there to parties that are part of his coalition. Um, and again, this really sent a shockwave. Interesting points to note there is that Colombia actually has a free trade agreement with the United States, which again is a point of contention for the left. But many people in Colombia were using this to say, how can you increase tariffs on us when we have this agreement? We've had this agreement for over a decade. That was one point. Um, and so when this sort of tit for tat, threat to threat thing sort of escalated, this was all again happening on social media. So Petro had made a statement on social media. Donald Trump responded on Truth Social. Petro responds on Twitter. And so after that, there's sort of silence. And it becomes clear, of course, that obviously there's going to be diplomatic discussions which actually address this, um, to be able to kind of get out of this impasse. And what it seems like is that the foreign minister was traveled to Washington, and they did have this kind of set of discussions, initial discussions about what was going to happen with these specific flights. And then both the White House and the Foreign Ministry of Colombia essentially announced that they had resolved the issue. Trump, in his statement, essentially claimed victory and said that Colombia has agreed to every single condition that I put forward. And we saw 2 days later that this was not exactly true. So in some, he made it seem like Petro completely caved, but Petro's government in their statement, again, I know this is a very kind of back and forth situation, but this is really how it went down. It was a back and forth between these two governments. In this statement of the Petro government, they said, no, we were able to achieve these dignified conditions. And it's true that 2 days later, on Tuesday, flights arrived to Colombia that were flown by the Colombian Air Force. The people who were being deported were not wearing handcuffs. In different interviews, people expressed that they had been given better treatment after the intervention of the Colombian government. But I think what's important to point out here is that, what does this mean for the flights going forward? Are they all going to be, there weren't that many details that have been released so far, so we don't know, is the Colombian Air Force going to be flying all of the deportation flights? There's several flights a week. What does this mean for the other countries? Are all of the immigrants going to be, receiving the treatment that we saw that happened to the Brazilians? There was a news article in Ecuador that some migrants had denounced that they had essentially been handcuffed the entire flight, and then 20 minutes before landing, they took the handcuffs off. So it's a really difficult thing, because these countries do have to receive these migrants, of course. Where else are they going to go if they're already being detained? The most humane solution is that they arrive home safely. But what these leaders are saying is that it must be in dignified conditions.
So Zoe, Gustavo Petro's response was, quite bold and brave. And I'm just wondering, given Trump's ongoing attacks against leaders of Latin America, saying he wants to take back the Panama Canal, he made some threats towards Mexico, the way he acted with the Brazilians, the way he acted with the Colombians. What has been the response regionally so far? Because after what happened with Gustavo Petro and Trump, there did seem to be some call, I think it was by the president of Honduras, called for like a meeting of CELAC. So I'm just curious, what's the progressive government response so far to Donald Trump? Could we be seeing perhaps a unifying moment in Latin America because of Trump's aggression?
Yeah, well, today the CELAC meeting was supposed to be held. It was postponed or canceled. So we don't really know what is going to happen next with that. But immediately after the Petro Trump rebuttal, there was an outpouring of support for the Colombian government, and kind of this, reiterating this stand of dignity that Petro was trying to take. This is going to be a constant point of contention over the next couple of years. There's so many different elements to this. Not only are Latin American migrants being vilified in the media, there's so much hate speech directed at migrants, not only by elected officials, but also, again, in mainstream media. So they're not only being kind of like stigmatized in this huge way, they're being criminalized, they're being arrested, they're being deported, but also, again, the impact that this will have on Latin America does not end there. It's not just about what happens in the United States and this horrific and dehumanizing treatment that migrants face, but also how is this going to impact Latin American countries that are going to be receiving, tens of thousands of migrants in some cases, if Donald Trump is actually making good on his word to deport, 10 million people. These countries, which are already suffering under the boot of U.S. imperialism, are already dealing with structural issues because of neoliberal policies, because of debt. And now they're going to receive all of these people who are, of course, unemployed, left their countries in the first place because of this economic misery. And then another impact that these countries are going to face is, for example, the remittances that are sent. Mexico last year recorded a record level of remittances that were sent back to Mexico. This, in the Central American countries, makes up a large part of their economies. So this is going to really be a huge impact on them, on how they deal with of course the migrant population that's being deported to them, and then their economies. So they're taking stands in terms of defending their compatriots, their countrymen that are in the United States and facing this mistreatment. Once again, saying that Trump, the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. This is a united Latin America that's going to stand up to the U.S. and U.S. imperialism. But again, also kind of grappling with the impact that these deportations will have in their home countries. We know that Mexico has proposed kind of a comprehensive plan to receive migrants. They have shelters that they've set up and reintegration programs. But this is Mexico is, of course, it's one of the largest migrant populations in the United States, and they have been very clear that this will largely impact their country. But in other countries, has the infrastructure been developed yet? What impact will this have? Again, this is a problem, and this is an issue that goes beyond the borders of the United States.
Yeah, no, an important issue, and there's a lot there and a lot to be said. And this is one of the many reasons why we appreciate People's Dispatch, because you're covering it all in all the countries all the time. A lot to be here. We'll continue to follow this story. Zoe, we really appreciate you sticking with us and joining us here once again on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.